Hello, you sentient ball of stardust. My name is Casey Davis. I'm a therapist and I'm an author of the book How to Keep House While Drowning, where I talk about ways to make it a little bit easier to take care of yourself when you're overwhelmed, stressed, have mental health issues, physical health issues, or maybe you're just in a hard season of life. Maybe you're looking for a place that you can come and listen to some practical advice. This is a podcast for all of the self-help rejects. We're going to talk about skills for survival and self-kindness. And I'm going to leave the pop psychology at the door. I promise not to tell you to meditate or to journal. We're just going to give you some really insightful conversations with hopefully some practical advice. So I don't believe you need to pick yourself up by the bootstraps. I don't want you to just try harder, and I don't believe that laziness exists. So join me over on Struggle Care, where we can find compassionate solutions that help us function a little bit better.
Wells Fargo presents one of the surest ways to grow your money. A Wells Fargo CD account, where you can earn a 5.00% annual percentage yield on an 11-month term with a minimum opening deposit of $5,000. Visit a Wells Fargo branch or wellsfargo.com/CD rates to open a CD account and start growing your savings with us.
Wells Fargo Bank, N.A., member FDIC.
Hey there, thinkers. It's me, your host, Elena Grace, and you're listening to another episode of I've Been Thinking. So thank you very, very much for that. As always, I so appreciate you being here, and I can't wait for you guys to hear today's episode. So I brought on a college classmate of mine. We had a handful of painting classes together, and he is a super talented artist in his own right, but he is also a really, really talented curator and writer. So for today's episode, Josh Porter is here to talk to us about curating art exhibits to send a message, right? To tell a story. And so we talk about that, and that's really what gets us started. But eventually we actually get a little bit deeper, which of course was kind of the point, right? So we talk about how Josh's mission, at least right now in his curation and his artwork and his writing, is to uplift the storytelling of queer voices and to highlight queer history, which is always so, so important. And we talk a lot about kind of some of the nuances of that and that kind of thing. So I highly recommend this episode. But one of my favorite parts and kind of the thing that inspired me to bring this to Josh, and thankfully he agreed to come on and talk to me about it, was he recently did a really incredible exhibition on masculinity. And again, we go into a lot of these things way deeper in the episode, of course, but it is so interesting, so interesting, the many different ways that people can think of masculinity, right? Or can think of femininity or whatever it is. So Josh's mission in his curation is really very much like I've Been Thinking's mission. It is to highlight and share different perspectives, different ways of thinking, and to challenge people's pre-existing conceptions, right? So I'm really excited to bring you guys Josh today. He is a wealth of information specifically about queer history and queer art, and specifically about queer history in the Lexington, Kentucky area. He has done incredible work on that, and I can't wait for you guys to listen to this one. But let me tell you, if you think that queer history or queer art isn't something you want to hear about or something you're interested in, it's just not like your normal thing, I really do challenge you to listen to this episode because it's good and it is interesting. And if nothing else, it'll make you think about something today that you hadn't thought about before, maybe. So I really, really am excited about this episode, and I hope that you guys enjoy it and are excited about it as well. All of that being said, here's Josh.
My name is Josh Porter, and I'm an independent curator at the moment, based out of Lexington, Kentucky. I'm finishing up graduate school at the University of Kentucky, getting my MFA in curatorial studies. So not sure what's next after that at the moment. Currently just figuring that out. But that's kind of where I'm at right now, is finishing up this master's program and exploring the world of curating.
I think that is so neat that is the world you're finding your place in. And I think you're doing a really wonderful job, of finding your place in it. Some of the exhibits that you have curated have just been absolutely incredible to see. I see your Facebook and social media posts about them. And that's really what inspired me to ask you if you wanted to come on the podcast, specifically your Masculinity Reimagined exhibition, because I thought that was really, really beautiful. And in particular, on your website, where you talk about it, by encompassing a range of gender and sexual identifications, these artists share their own personal experiences, interpretations, performances, rejections, and embodiments of masculinity. Breaking down the barrier created between masculinity and femininity, they embrace feminist and queer approaches to reimagining our cultural understandings of gender. And I thought that was so interesting and very much the kind of topic that I would love to explore more here on I've Been Thinking, because while I have brought queer voices onto the show before, that's just not something that I have gotten to explore as deeply as I would like. So I would love to hear more about this show and what inspired you and brought you to it, and how you went about it.
Yeah, totally. So that shows, it's funny because that's my thesis exhibition. This exhibition is kind of the culmination of my master's program. And I'm actually, in conjunction with the show, I'm going to have an exhibition catalog coming out soon. So I'm writing a curator's essay. So I've actually been thinking about this show a lot and really thinking about this idea of reimagining masculinity as I've been writing that curator's essay, and as I've been finishing up this exhibition catalog. And so going into the show, I had started focusing on sort of ideas of queerness and queer art about halfway through my program. And sort of coming to terms with it myself, and my own identity was happening around that time as well. And so I wanted my thesis exhibition to almost be introspective in a way of how was I feeling about masculinity and sexuality and queerness in my own mind, and then looking for artists that are kind of working with these ideas was how I went about that. And so then also I think the artists really defined much of this show. So I had queer artists, I had non-binary artists, I had a woman artist. And so having all of these different perspectives on masculinity was really important to me. Especially I think there's a big prominence in queer art, especially where when you talk about masculinity, you almost always see these sort of thin, white, muscular male bodies is really embodying that idea of masculinity, of that even in queerness, that were still kind of aspiring to these heteronormative ideals.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to sort of challenge that a bit with the show. But even in that challenge, I personally did not want the show to be like, oh, men are bad, masculinity is terrible, we hate that. Like, that
Yeah.
wasn't the viewpoint that I wanted to take. I really wanted people to walk into this space and feel much more like excited for the future, excited for the potential, and really, which of course deals with those difficulties. And I think the show still, yeah, and the show still does those things, referencing, what is masculinity? How do we define what's masculine, what's feminine? Um, Especially just as time goes on, those definitions inherently change anyway. And so I wanted to really explore how artists, yeah, looking internally at their own personal experiences, but also what they were seeing in the world around them as well.
I think that that is really, really, really interesting. And of course, really important that you're exploring this variety of perspectives. That's exactly what I try to do on I've Been Thinking, is explore and uplift and just share different perspectives. So I think that that is just a really incredible opportunity that you've given these artists to come together and bring this show through this really beautiful narrative, but that you're also giving the viewer this wide variety to consume and really just encourage lots of different avenues for critical thinking for the viewer. And really, that's kind of what, would you say that's what curation kind of is?
Yeah, so how I see curation kind of at this point, how I've been framing it recently, um, is really just trying to share the artist's stories and share their work, but also doing that in a way that recontextualizes sometimes the artwork and places it in conjunction with other artwork and really creates new opportunities for artwork and sort of the interpretation of it. Um, which I think is exciting for curators, viewers, the artists, is thinking about how the meaning and sort of interpretation of an artwork can change depending on where you see it, what's around it, the terminology that's around it. Like I think some of the pieces in the show specifically, you wouldn't think to be about masculinity until it's put in conjunction with these other artworks. You're like, oh, now I see this connection. Um, which I think is really interesting as a curator, where it's, I'm not necessarily giving these works meaning or giving them new um, meanings, but rather I'm placing them in a space with other artworks that allows for that openness of interpretation by the viewer. Because I definitely prefer for an exhibition to be open-ended and to allow the viewer and the artist a lot of freedom in how they interpret it and how they interact with it. Like I didn't want this exhibition to tell people what masculinity is, but rather I wanted it to allow options of what masculinity could be, thinking about, the vastness of possibility within contemporary reimaginings of masculinity.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's super. I think that's a really wonderful explanation of what curation is. Not putting something, not giving something a new meaning, rather, but allowing for the opportunity because it's in a new or different context to be interpreted differently. I think that's super interesting. Apparently super is my word today. I always have some word I repeat until I realize it.
I
But I
feel
think
that.
that's incredibly interesting, and it definitely opens up a lot of opportunity for the viewer. But I have to wonder also, as an artist, how much it can maybe change or like challenge the artist as well. Like, does
Oh
my
yeah.
piece of artwork fit this interpretation? Or like,
Hmm.
you know, that kind of thing. Because I've definitely thought to myself about shows I've thought about entering, like, oh, I don't know if I have something that fits that, but maybe I do, and it's just not as black and white as I'm thinking of it, right?
Yeah, that definitely happened, I think, in the show a bit. This idea of, oh, is this actually about masculinity? Does this feel forced? And that's definitely something that as a curator, you have to balance of, because if you keep it just very black and white, like, oh, the artist has to say it's about this, or else I can't include it in a show about this. Um, and so allowing this idea that artwork can mean different things, it's always going to be a sort of back and forth, and it should be this back and forth with the artist and the curator on sort of how flexible the artist can be with their work, but also, artists still should want their work to be framed in a certain way. Like, that's totally
Right.
understandable, but also being flexible, and working with curators and trusting a curator. Like a lot of the artists, like when I curate an exhibition, the artists don't necessarily always know what the show's going to look like once I put it up. Like, honestly, sometimes I don't even know exactly how it's going to look until I put it up. And so that sort of trust between artists and curators, very important, especially in shows like this with such like personal topics. So these idea of masculinity, I do have some non-binary artists in this show. So that was sometimes a difficult thing to sort of grapple with is, you know, dealing with masculinity and femininity when as an individual that can be a very difficult topic. Um, and so, yeah, that sort of trust and bond between artist and curator is always very important to make sure that the artwork is being shown in a good light, I guess.
Right. So I think that you are doing a really beautiful job of highlighting specifically queer voices,
Hmm.
and minority voices and that kind of thing. And I am looking at your portfolio on your website right now, and that idea of trust between the artist and the curator is really interesting because I can see how difficult that can be for so many of these subjects that you're highlighting, and that
Yeah, that's
you're,
especially
yeah, go ahead, go ahead.
well, yeah, I think too, like specifically this idea of telling queer stories is something that lately I've been really like the about section on my website where it's like my little curator statement. Like I've lately been wanting to go back and rewrite that because I think the framework of my curating and how I want to continue it is telling queer stories and showcasing queer history, queer artists, queer art, but really queer stories is like what I want to tell, what I want to show. Um, but doing that is a lot of times a very complicated task because throughout history, a lot of queerness was not only forced to be hidden, but also, hidden for safety. If you, if it was known that you were queer or known, if it was known that you were queer, then that could be a dangerous position to be in. And
Right.
so I'm specifically thinking about the sort of Here, Black Them and Queer exhibition that I have up at UK right now. A lot of these individuals, were doing these things in secret and didn't want to be seen. Um, and so it's a really interesting relationship to then, we want to tell these stories because this is history that isn't told, but then also kind of respecting that idea of opacity, which I've written about a bit in class or in school. This idea of transparency versus opacity, um, of choosing whether you want to be seen or not, which is a very complicated kind of issue, especially in our digital age. And it gets into ideas of like surveillance and stuff. And thinking about, but specifically thinking about queer stories, that's definitely a difficult thing. Um, is how much, you know, yeah, how much opacity and secrecy should there still be versus telling these stories that need, that do have such a strong impact. like with this exhibition that I did, so many of my friends, students, professors, didn't know about these histories. And so it's very informative to them. But also, I've posted something that interesting happened with this show. When I first put it up in the beginning of the year, I posted about it on Facebook, and I was getting a ton of messages and comments from people that knew the individuals that I was showcasing in my show. And so they were telling me more stories and sending me
Wow.
more photos. And so then I ended up about a week ago, I think, I not redid, but I updated the show into a second display case with a bunch of new photographs and new stories from those Facebook messages. And so it really was hearing community stories and thinking about, what impact these individuals had. Because I started the exhibition solely with photographs and information from the Faulkner Morgan Archive, which is a local Kentucky-based queer-focused archive. Um, and so which I'd interned them with them last year and really stayed connected and involved. And so I curated this show using their photographs, but then was able to add a bunch of other photographs from Facebook messages, which I thought was really, really fun and just opens up this idea of, these queer stories aren't from history books, they're from people, they're from Facebook, they're from, people remembering.
Right. And it's not something that's in a history book from so long ago. It's from
Hmm.
somebody who is on Facebook telling you the story, which gives
Yep.
such a level of connection. Because to that viewer, they might say, wow, look at this piece of history behind a piece of glass. But to know that it came from somebody who is not only still alive, but wasn't like interviewed on their deathbed, but literally chimed in on Facebook and said, hey, that was
Yeah.
my friend, or I was there, that kind of, that
Hmm.
a whole new level of connection. And that, oh, sorry, I knocked over a canvas. So, normal problems.
Oh, yes.
So I'm really intrigued by that, by two things that you brought up, and we can explore one, whichever one you want. I think that idea of transparency versus opacity, having the importance of sharing the story, but also the right to be anonymous if you so choose. Like,
Hmm.
that is so interesting and so difficult, so nuanced. And I'm also really intrigued by the connection that all of this brings about, and those kind of are connected, really.
Yeah.
If you'd like to talk some more about that, I would love to hear it.
Hmm. Yeah, I think it's interesting to specifically thinking about transparency and opacity in regards to queerness, because I think specifically in this situation of potentially being outed, that history of being forced to come out, I think is a sad reality for a lot of queer people of not being able to choose that moment for yourself. Um,
Absolutely.
and so, yeah, this idea of being seen as queer a lot of times isn't a choice and was forced upon somebody. Either somebody knew it or they just were like, oh, you act a certain way, so therefore I'm
Uh-huh.
going to just assume. And so, yeah, this idea that you don't get to choose when to come to terms with that identity can be very complex. Um, but also, yeah, this idea that this isn't in history books. And so part of the like growing up, you don't hear queer stories, you don't learn about queer history. Um, and so it's is important to tell those stories to show people that this isn't new, this isn't something that is only in this young generation. This has been here, queerness has been here for so long. Um, and it's important to learn that history and share that history. And so, yeah, it's definitely a complex kind of issue, but that's something that as a curator, I think is a very unique position to be in, is finding and researching these stories and this history, and then figuring out a way to showcase them in a way that respects the past and respects these individuals, and showcases their story. And that's kind of why I frame it in a way of telling queer stories, because I think storytelling in so many different traditions has such a long history um, of respecting the past by telling their stories. And so I kind of want to continue that practice of telling stories as a way to showcase the history and showcase these individuals.
I love that. I love that way of thinking about it, that showcasing, telling these stories is an extension of their lives in a way, because
Hmm.
you are helping them continue, helping them live on in our memory, in our history, in our storytelling, because clearly we're talking about them right now and
Yeah.
their importance, and really just proliferating their legacy to a new whole new audience and a whole new level.
Oh yeah, the audience part I think is a crucial part of that. Like
Absolutely.
having this on campus, you're having all these students, these 18, 19, 20-year olds walking into the library and seeing all these photographs and you're like, "Oh, what is this?" And it's like, "Oh, these are, trans women, drag queens, queer people from the 60s and 70s and 80s." And so it really is emphasizing, especially in today's times with all this new legislation, that this isn't new, that this has been here for so, so, so long. And I think, too, sort of with this exhibition, again, specifically, it started with photographs. It's thinking about the way that these people were documenting themselves. They were taking photos. They wanted these things to last in some way, in some respect. And so thinking about why were these photographs being taken? What were they wanting these photographs to be? Were they wanting this to be a document of history? Were these just personal photographs? Um, is very interesting. It's a very interesting way to look at these photos. So I kind of have framed them a bit as documentary, of being a way to document queer life, queer, and sort of preserve queerness. And especially with, the huge loss of life we had with the HIV and AIDS crisis, that was really important to preserve this history. And so I personally see a lot of these photographs as doing that, as preserving a history that could have easily been so lost and still can be lost. It still is a very volatile history because it's not necessarily written down in
Right.
these places and is dependent on stories. And so that's why I have loved working with the Faulkner Morgan Archive, because they preserve the objects, but they also do oral history projects, and they do this work that is preserving this history, that is so so important. And so I am hoping to use sort of my curatorial work as one avenue to also tell and preserve those stories for sure.
I think that's really admirable that in a way you're at least at this point dedicating yourself and your work to sharing these stories and uplifting them to new audiences, like we said. And I think it's especially important in places like on UK's campus, where you
Hmm.
have such a cross section of the youth of Kentucky and the world.
Hmm.
Really, of course, it is limited in a lot of ways, but it's an incredible cross section, and you're sharing these stories with them, and it is so much more personal because these are Kentuckian stories, these are
Hmm.
Lexington stories,
Yep.
these are people who probably partied in some of the same houses they're partying in, walked
Exactly. I
the
mean,
same
half of
streets. Yeah.
yeah, like I mean, half of the photos in this show are from the bar complex that's open every Thursday, Friday, Saturday. Like the same stage, the same dance floor, the same booths. Like it's
Yes.
those places that you can go to these places and go to this history. Um, and so it's so fascinating. And specifically, yeah, this idea that these are Kentuckians. There's this idea, I mean, even in the queer community and the drag community, that this came from major metropolitan areas, and then came to Kentucky, that all of this sort of, the drag or just queerness in general was centered around major metropolitan areas, and it wasn't that significant here. Um, but we can see, if you look through the Falcon Morgan archive or you look at this history, there's such a strong history in Kentucky, in Lexington, of queerness and queer people and queer performance. And so with curating too, I've really been framing how I look at this history in the arts, and sort of how has queerness been documented and transformed through art, whether that's photography or drag performance. And so really thinking about that as the avenue of viewpoint. But yeah, this idea that these are Kentuckians is so huge for me. And that's what sort of the name came from, is here, Black, Femme, and Queer. Like, it's people from Lexington. This is not being from afar.
Right.
And so, but I did continue to create it in conversation with the major metropolitan areas like New York. So this is at the Fine Arts Library on UK's campus. And in the lobby of the library, I worked with the Falcon Morgan Archive to put up these vinyl banners of photographs of Marsha P. Johnson, the sort of New York City trans activist. And the photographs were actually taken by Lee Black Childers, and he was a gay man from Kentucky who moved to New York City and photographed tons of famous people. And so these were photographs from his estate that the archive acquired. And so we got those in the lobby of the library, and then I got this inside of the library in display cases. And so those sort of play together in a lot of ways, of that idea of documentation through photography of queerness, and specifically Black trans individuals sort of play a crucial part in that story. But in our history, they're oftentimes overlooked. And so I really want to emphasize that aspect of local queer history and sort of connect the two. As there's also a long history of people leaving Kentucky to go to New York and then making a huge impact. We have people like, I'm blanking. I'd have to look at the Falcon. There's a story on the Falcon Morgan Archive website, I wrote a blog about someone named Shay Metcalf, who's a gay man from Kentucky, grew up in Lancaster, Kentucky. He moved to New York City and ended up meeting Andy Warhol, and now the Falcon Morgan Archive actually has a t-shirt and underwear signed by Andy Warhol that was gifted to Shay Metcalf, which I think is really funny.
That is funny.
So we see a lot of those connections. Yeah, it's so funny, just in the archive, just underwear signed by Andy Warhol. But yeah, like this history, like that's a Kentucky-born guy, and so he eventually passed away of HIV and AIDS. But like that connection is so crucial, and we don't hear these stories. And so I really, really was excited to share it. It's just I'm obsessed with the archive and these stories and these photos. Like truly obsessed.
No, I think it's a great obsession to have. And I love that you're focusing on these Kentucky stories, because I think too often Kentucky and Appalachian in general, stories like this aren't shared, or aren't shared enough, or aren't shared on the platforms that they deserve to be shared on, because they're all such important parts of history that we're just not given or not taught to think about. But just the fact that this Kentucky boy from Lancaster went to New York City and knew Andy Warhol, or that a Kentucky boy went to New York City and photographed Marsha P. Johnson, like that makes it even more real, right? It's like, it's kind of like the 6 degrees of separation, where you know somebody who knows somebody who knows the president or whatever.
Exactly.
Like that brings you so much closer to these major figures and makes it really beautiful. And really special that you are now exploring this and putting it on this stage for more people to be even connected to,
Oh yeah.
or to
Yeah,
maybe
I like
realize
thinking.
their connections that they already had. Sorry.
Mhm. Yeah, well, I think one of the biggest examples of that is the exhibition is the story of Sweet Evening Breeze. Um, so Sweets is kind of someone that there's been a lot sort of discovered and talked about with her, especially from the Fulton Morgan archive, um, where she was this kind of queer, probably trans woman who, we don't really know because a lot of things were different back then, obviously.
Right.
But so she was actually born in the 1890s.
Wow.
Um, yeah, and her parents had actually been enslaved too. And so
Oh,
that,
God.
and she grew up and eventually lived in Lexington for a really long time and would at night literally dress in drag and walk down Main Street with a parasol and sort of parade down the street. And it's interesting because you would think, oh, this was, started in the 70s or this started in the 30s and 40s and went on through the 70s and 80s. Um, and so you would think that that would be very sort of frowned upon and sort of placing herself in positions to be attacked or, harassed. But, and she obviously was many times, but there's this kind of environment around her where everyone loved Sweet Evening Breeze. And so you'll hear stories from people outside of the queer community who would say, oh, I remember driving down Main Street with my parents, and we would all roll our windows down and say hi to Sweet Evening Breeze because everyone loved Sweet Evening Breeze. Um, and so, like, this idea that this black trans woman in Lexington was loved and revered by so many in a way, even though obviously there were also lots of difficulties and dangers in her life as well. Um, but that history isn't far removed. I mean, you can ask so many people in Lexington and they'll have a Sweet Evening Breeze story.
Yeah.
And a lot of the individuals in the show that I did and the people associated with the Fulton Morgan archive met Sweets and knew Sweets and hung out with Sweets. And so it's like two separations away from, someone who was born in the 1890s and dressed in drag and walked down the street and was like, it's just crazy to me.
Yeah, it's crazy that this person who dressed in drag was born to enslaved parents was a public, well-known, well-loved figure in Lexington,
Mm-hmm.
Kentucky, and you don't expect that
Mm-hmm.
with
And these,
with knowledge of the time, of the place, and people of course love stereotypes of Kentucky, and
yep,
some of them can be true, just like any stereotype, but I hate them. I hate stereotypes.
yep.
So,
Well, and I mean, it really is. Kentucky is seen as this place of, oh, queer people aren't here, or
right.
at least queer people aren't accepted here, and that's this backwards place that no one should be, that it's a very behind the times place, when in reality, there are moments and places and people that place Kentucky in a much more progressive light than we like to think,
Yeah.
which is really interesting. And actually, Sweet Evening Breeze now has a mural in Lexington that is at 161 North Limestone. It was part of the Prohibition murals, painted by Gaia, I think is the street artist's name. But it's this beautiful purple mural
I've seen
of
pictures. It
Sweets.
is beautiful.
Yeah, it's my favorite purple. It's so pretty. But it's her sitting in front of all of her silver that she owned. And so, like, at the Fulton Morgan archive, I've seen some of that silver, some of the, like, teapots and things. And so it's, like, just crazy history that isn't that far away, you know,
Yeah.
but I truly am obsessed with the archive and these queer stories.
Well, it sounds like the archive is an awesome way for anybody to kind of learn
Mhm.
about these queer stories that are so, so important. And I love that they're doing like oral history, and they have all of these photos and everything. I think that's so wonderful.
Yeah, and you can, and they are like the archive is meant to be used as well. Like they want researchers, students, anyone that has a passion to reach out and be like, oh, I want to learn about, um, the gay student organization at UK and the forming of it and sort of what happened. Because they have stuff about that, like they want people, they don't want to just collect this information and hold it. They also want it to be shared and researched and explored. And so they do that through people coming in to research, but also through different events and presentations. Like I recently helped organize a viewing of The Last Gospel of the Pagan Babies,
I saw that.
which is with a film that's about the Pagan Babies, which was specifically this like queer punk performance group. Um, and so the film sort of explores that and touches on some of these other histories. But we actually talked about after we watched that film, we did like a little panel talk back. And one of the things we talked about was, that that film misses a lot of Kentucky queer history because, I mean, it's only a 90-minute movie. And so this idea that in 90 minutes, we're still skipping a majority of Kentucky queer history, I think says a lot that
Yeah.
there is so much history to be told. And so I like, even though it's like, oh, it didn't talk about this, where it's like, that's exciting. That means that there is so much there to talk about that we could do more. If
Yeah.
all of Lexington's queer history could fit into a 90-minute film, then there's not much there to it. But in fact, the archive has like 15,000 items and like 250 hours of recorded interviews. And so it's like there is so much information there, and it's such a rich resource. And so, yeah, I love the archive, and it's a wonderful, wonderful organization.
That's really awesome. Do you know who is Faulkner Morgan? Like, who's it named after?
Oh, yeah. So the name came from the combination. Well, it started with the collection of artist Robert Morgan, who's a gay artist from Lexington. Him and historian Dr. Jonathan Coleman got together to sort of document all of the things that Bob owned because Bob just has a lot of stuff in his house. Um, but he
Relatable.
also, but part of that too is he inherited a lot from the artist Henry Faulkner from Lexington, and so Henry was also a gay artist, and so Bob inherited a lot of stuff from him, and so the archive started with the combination of their collections of the Henry Faulkner stuff and Robert Morgan stuff, and so they combined that to create the Faulkner Morgan archive. But that was in 2014, and since then it has really grown to be a comprehensive, or is working to be a comprehensive Kentucky queer history archive, where people donate and they make acquisitions and things like that. And so it has definitely grown from that, but it started kind of with the collection of Henry Faulkner and Robert Morgan.
That's amazing. That is really, really neat that it came that it came from these two Kentucky artists and
Hmm.
has just grown into a resource that can now be used by everybody, but also is for the memory and the continuation of queer stories.
Yes, it's wonderful.
That's really amazing. That sounds like, yeah, just an incredible resource. That's really
Yeah,
cool.
there's even on their website, they have something called Lexington's Pride of Place, which is a walking tour of downtown Lexington of like I think 10 or 12 different queer locations and sites in downtown Lexington. And so that's a really fun self-guided little tour to take um, that I just love.
Heck yeah. Yeah, that sounds really cool. I'll definitely put a link to their website in the show
Hmm.
notes for this episode because that sounds really awesome. And I'll try to link directly to that walking tour too.
Wonderful.
Josh, thank you so much for coming on the show today. Can you give us, well, first of all, actually, is there anything that you want to end on that we haven't hit already? Because I don't want to leave you feeling like you left something out.
I don't think so. I think kind of touched on everything that I'm kind of doing at the moment. That's a weird
Beautiful.
thing. I'm kind of like, I don't know what I'm doing next.
Yeah, I get that too. That's a really scary place to be, but it can also be freeing.
So exciting, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's
yeah,
scary and exciting.
yeah, for sure. So resources, we talked obviously kind of in depth about the Faulkner Morgan archive. Anything else that you would like to leave our listener with?
Um, yeah, I think for me and I mean, if I think about my journey sort of as a curator and thinking about queer artwork, I've really been looking at there are two institutions, national outside of the Faulkner Morgan Archive. There are two other organizations that I kind of look at for inspiration to find queer artists, to look at queer art and queer stories. And so one of those is the Leslie Lohman Museum of Art in New York City, that specifically focuses on queer art and queer artists. And then the other is the GLBT History Museum in San Francisco. Both of those, I visited the Leslie Lohman, I've not visited the GLBT Historical Museum. And so, but both of those on their website, I can really tell do such strong work on collecting, preserving, and exhibiting LGBTQ history and culture and art. And so I highly recommend checking those out. And yeah, I guess that's sort of the main point.
Yeah, awesome. Those are really awesome resources, and I'll definitely link to those as well. So, where can the listener find you? Find your socials, your website, your exhibitions, or anything that's happening at the moment?
Yeah, I try to make it very easy. So I am at It's Josh Porter on everything. So ITS Josh Porter. And then my website's itsjoshporter.com. And I post about anything and everything there, especially about my work. I love photographing my work and my exhibitions. So I feel like I have a very strong set of photographs and sort of writings on my website archiving my work.
I
Um,
think you do.
and so I've loved my website's my little baby. I love working on it. But yeah, so it's at It's Josh Porter everywhere on Instagram, my website. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that your website is really beautifully done, and I think it is definitely a good representation of you. I know you like decently well. We went to Transy together,
Yes.
et cetera, et cetera, and we took painting classes together.
Hmm.
So I think the version of you, at least that I know, I think it's an awesome representation, and I think it's incredibly well done.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Well, Josh, thank you for coming on today and talking about this with me. I hope that the listeners enjoyed it, and maybe we'll talk again.
Of course. Thank you so much again.
Y'all, thank you so much for listening. I appreciate you a million bajillion times. As always, check out www.ivebeenThinkingPod.com for resources, for links from today's episode, for the show notes, all of that stuff, as well as resources and links from previous episodes, blog posts, yada, 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 the whole shebang, right? Find us on Instagram at I've Been Thinking Pod. You can really get to know Tyler and I a little bit better on there because we are posting. And we also keep you up to date on what's going on the Instagram pretty well too. If you would like to support the pod in a monetary way, we would love if you subscribe to the Patreon, patreon.com/I've Been Thinking Pod. That's an awesome way to support us and encourage us. There's exclusive content on there, that kind of thing. It's growing, and we're really excited about it. And finally, if you really want to support us, but you don't want to give us your money, that's cool too. Share us. Send us to a friend. We would absolutely love that. That is actually the best thing you could possibly do for us. Send us to a friend, share us on your social media, and give us a review or a rating wherever you listen. You have no idea how helpful that is. That is the number one way for us to grow. So please share us with a friend today. Thank you guys so much for listening. This episode was hosted by me, Elena Grace Campbell. It has been produced by Tyler Miller. Our guest for today's episode was Josh Porter, and the tippy tappies in the background were courtesy of podcast mascot Win. We are proudly presented by Stoveleg Media.
Hello, you sentient ball of stardust. My name is Casey Davis. I'm a therapist, and I'm an author of the book How to Keep House While Drowning, where I talk about ways to make it a little bit easier to take care of yourself when you're overwhelmed, stressed, have mental health issues, physical health issues, or maybe you're just in a hard season of life. Maybe you're looking for a place that you can come and listen to some practical advice. This is a podcast for all of the self-help rejects. We're going to talk about skills for survival and self-kindness. And I'm going to leave the pop psychology at the door. I promise not to tell you to meditate or to journal. We're just going to give you some really insightful conversations with hopefully some practical advice. So I don't believe you need to pick yourself up by the bootstraps. I don't want you to just try harder, and I don't believe that laziness exists. So join me over on Struggle Care, where we can find compassionate solutions that help us function a little bit better.
Wells Fargo presents one of the surest ways to grow your money. A Wells Fargo CD account, where you can earn a 5.00% annual percentage yield on an 11-month term with a minimum opening deposit of $5,000. Visit a Wells Fargo branch or wellsfargo.com/CD rates to open a CD account and start growing your savings with us.
Wells Fargo Bank, N.A. member FDIC.